Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, but there are other people in the room who are oddly not.
Yes, that's me, Tim Saywood. Hello again.
Hello.
Long time no see. Well, no speak.
Really?
Well, I suppose so, yeah.
What a Trappist existence you must have had.
Indeed.
You and I had the great pleasure of going to see Rodgers and Hammerstein's Allegro. I mean, I say great pleasure, we'll talk about in a minute whether or not it was. But Allegro has this sort of legendary status, it seems to me. What did you know about it before we went in?
Very little indeed, actually. In fact, it had been a long time since I'd sort of checked out what it was, as it were, and so I knew it had something to do with Sondheim, and I got it muddled up with the one where here, I think, did the Do I Hear a Waltz, where he did the lyrics
with Rodgers.
Yeah. So initially I thought it was going to be that, but they soon put me right. And that's pretty much it. I mean, all I knew is obviously that it wasn't a great success, because that was the thing that came to define it. I now know, having subsequently checked, that Sondheim was involved, but he was like the T-boy, wasn't he?
Yes, it was his very first job in theatre or something during his summer break from college.
That's right, yeah.
And obviously he had an in, didn't he, through Oscar Hammerstein?
He did.
Did you know any of the music, any of the score?
I'd never heard a single note of it until we actually went to see it. So, again, expectations literally... Well, obviously one has certain expectations of Rodgers and Hammerstein. If you go to see a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, you know that there's going to be a boy and a girl and they're going to fall in love. I mean, that much is clear.
Were there fewer Nazis than you were expecting?
Exactly.
Fewer nuns?
Yeah, no, I've run the statistics on that one, and actually they appear less often than you'd imagine, the Nazis, based on the representative sample I once used as my benchmark for Rodgers and Hammerstein. But anyway, and I was expecting a bit of small town America in it, and indeed there is, and I was expecting it. And this, to me, is the ultimate characteristic of all Rodgers and Hammersteins, and it's a Hammerstein characteristic, really. I expected it to evince a simple faith in the good of humankind and of the family. And it's kind of interesting in that respect, isn't it?
Yes. I was going to say, I might ask you how your tick sheet looked at the end of this deal.
Well, fairly full.
I mean, it seems to me that what I knew about Allegro, because as I say, it has this sort of legendary status, but it also has this kind of invisible status.
Yeah.
The best legends are myths, almost. There is no evidence, or very little. People talk about it in these sort of hushed tones about the potential that it had, but it has it has two big bits of received wisdom and possibly a third. The first is that it was, and I quote, ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And that was one of the fundamental reasons why it failed, because it was so modernistic that people couldn't really understand yet what it was doing. And I suspect we'll have to talk about some of these things.
Yeah.
The second piece of received wisdom is that it is the second act that lets it down.
Yeah.
These are all fairly...
I was going to say, that's received wisdom about quite a lot of musicals as well, isn't it? I mean, second act trouble is known to be...
an issue.
A huge problem for a majority of music, even the jolly good ones, really. I mean,
Well, Into the Woods is not as good in the second act than the first.
To name but one example, yeah.
Well, it's less compact, I suppose, isn't it?
No, it's just rubbish.
Well,
Don't write in, listeners.
That's harsh. And then there's a piece of sort of semi... It's not quite as well known, but the third piece of received wisdom is it's the score that's most like Rodgers and Hart.
Yes.
Rather than Rodgers and Hammerstein as we understand.
Now, you had a bit of an in on this because you already knew or had as a favourite one of the songs that perhaps has the most flavour of Rodgers and Hart of all of them.
The heartiest of the bunch.
Indeed, yes.
Yes, which is The Gentleman is a Dope.
Yeah.
And it is, if you like, it's the Rodgers and Hammerstein song which has escaped from musical theatre into jazz, which is obviously where all the previous Rodgers and Hart songs, and indeed Gershwin numbers, ended up as standards. But we'll talk in a minute then a little bit about that as well, because I think, funnily enough, there's rather more to the Hartisms in this musical. In fact, some of them are direct. There's at least two Rodgers and Hart numbers which are actually quoted musically in the entire score as well. So it isn't just Hartic. Yes. I'm using lots of adjectives here.
Indeed, yeah.
But it actually is genuinely of Hart in some senses.
Yeah. Was Hart still around at this point?
No, he died in 1943.
Right, okay.
After the opening night of By Jupiter, which was the last Rodgers and Hart musical. Rodgers by this stage was being a little bit bigamist, in the sense he'd already worked with Hammerstein on Oklahoma and Carousel, but he was working with Hart as well on By Jupiter, on By Jupiter's opening night. Larry Hart went off on a huge alcoholic binge.
Yeah.
He was suffering from depression, and he was an alcoholic by this stage. He turned up several days later in a hotel room with pneumonia, was rushed to hospital and died.
Right.
48, I think he was.
Mm-hmm.
So that was rather a bad opening night for him,
yes.
although the show's good.
Indeed. Although Jonathan Larson has since topped it, but anyway.
He's topped.
Never mind.
Yes, I get the point.
Yeah.
So those are the 3 bits of received wisdom I knew about Allegro. And I must say that I was urged very strongly to go and see this production of Allegro at the Southwark Playhouse, which was on this summer, by an old friend of Musical Talk, John Sweeney, who I met in Edinburgh this year. I had a wonderful couple of chats with him, but he besought me to see it, right. And then he besought me again by email to go and see it.
Right.
And so I thought, well, you're quite right, John, because it is the kind of show one feels one ought to see for Musical Talk. So
is besought the past tense of beseech, by the way?
I think it must be.
Fascinating.
I'm glad we're staying on topic.
No, it's just, one for the QI elves, that one.
If they're listening.
Yeah.
So let's perhaps use those 3 bits of received wisdom then as a way of navigating our way through this discussion partly.
Yeah.
So the first one is that it's ahead of its time. Is, or could you see, the big problem with things which are ahead of their time is it's fine to be ahead of your time when you are ahead of your time. When you are now after your time by 70 years, because the show is very nearly 70 years
it's kind of difficult
old,
to judge it, yeah.
It is indeed. Did you sort of get what they were saying? I mean, in a nutshell, the argument is always being that it used cinematic tropes. And was one of the very first shows to do so.
Oh, right, okay. Well, on that front, I'm less sure, because that's a staging thing, and I must admit my history is a good deal shakier than that. It certainly isn't a Victorian box set type of a show.
Oh, no.
On the other hand, you'd had Brecht Weil by that time, and these were using these sort of more non-naturalistic style of performances. So I don't think you could say that they really pushed the boat. Perhaps for Broadway, it was. Interestingly, when you said ahead of its time, immediately my mind flew to the fact that it has this sort of split structure. It has the first half in this sort of very nostalgic environment where it's an everyman story and he grows up in a small town, and then in the second half he becomes an adult and he pursues a career in the big city. And it's the big city part that one is more inclined to think of as, quote, ahead of its time, and the reason being that Oklahoma and Carousel put themselves in this small town America and were very nostalgic as such. They were very down home, very sort of snug, very all of those sorts of things.
Warm and nostalgic.
And they and this starts in that place and then goes to a big city place, but it doesn't do so in a way that I think is particularly ahead of its time
or difficult to absorb.
No, exactly. So I don't know. I mean, everything's structured into scenes, and there are shorter bits and bobs. So no, it's ahead of the what was nostalgic at the time, but I don't think so. No. There's one other aspect which I just thought of. This is the everyman aspect of the story. There was, as we know, after Allegro, not necessarily because of it, a series of everyman stories in musical theatre. So Stop the World I Want to Get Off is one that immediately leaps out. The Anthony Newley, Leslie Brickus, I think, musical.
I think so, yeah.
Certainly Anthony Newley. And those sorts of structures and the revival of that sort of medieval structure to a story, that was something that was coming back into vogue. You can't really call it ahead of its time; it's medieval, but then again, ahead of the revival of such things. So maybe.
Well, I think we should also be talking about the legacy of Allegro later, and I know that's where Stephen Sondheim will hove into view very thoroughly. I think.
Yeah.
But. Well, let me ask you a question, and then I'll elaborate what I understand is identified as being the bits and pieces which were ahead of its time, or identified as such at least. But the question is Allegro a concept musical?
I never really know what's meant by concept musical, to be honest, but
it's
a premise-based musical, yes. I mean, it is about one person's story. So whereas Oklahoma and Carousel are what they call dual focus things, they're about a central couple. I don't know if that counts as a concept, I don't know, but
well, it's been done before.
This is much more about wider universals and things that are faced by every man at this time, certainly, and perhaps every woman, but certainly every man, in terms of the trajectory that the story takes. So I think, maybe it's a little bit epic if you in that sort of Brechtian sense.
Well, it's certainly trying to draw the idea of learning macro lessons from micro experiences, isn't it? I think that's the way. I think you can draw universal truths. It's trying to say from the individual experiences of one man. Whether that's true, well, in fact, I can say I don't think it is true, because I don't think the life of Joe Taylor Jr. does speak to me as another man.
Right.
But we can talk about whether it's artistically success later on.
I mean, obviously it starts from his very early childhood, and that's where you get a lot
his
of
birth.
Well, indeed,
yes.
Really. I mean, yes, really.
Unless they go back a little bit earlier than that, I think we've got everything there.
There are people in America who would argue that
it was immaculate, was it?
Anyway, never mind. Let's not go into that, where his personhood begins. But anyway, these experiences of literally learning to walk, which is a central metaphor in the whole thing by the time you get to the second act, is obviously a very nearly universal experience. And so I think it really cast its net very wide in terms of sort of, the audience getting the character experiences and perhaps being slightly more likely to invest emotionally. Slightly different to, walking around on a bright morning hymning the corn as high as an elephant's eye, or however they open Carousel, I forget now, or going to a fun fair. So
I hope I don't get beaten up by the man on the roundabout.
But literally one step, and then the other step we all get.
Well, you also spoke about being epic as well, because funny enough, apparently Oscar Hammerstein's, and he's the book writer here.
Yes.
He only wrote 2 books with Richard Rodgers. There's this and Me and Juliet, I think it is.
Right.
Neither of which have gone on to be the great successes of Rodgers and Hammerstein.
No.
But his original concept was actually to take someone from cradle to grave, all the way through an entire life, and it was only when they realised they just weren't going to get all of that in a coherent and cohesive way.
I think they could have flash-forwarded it at the end, but never mind.
Or frameworked it with him on his deathbed looking back.
Well, exactly. There's always a way.
But
Give
anyway,
me 5 minutes with that show, I could have sorted it out.
Well, if I could just squeeze in past your ego, I'll... But anyway, they decided that was too much, so they gave it... they made it his first half of his life, if you like. So it's from his birth in 1905 and his first 35 years on this planet. The programme of the Southwark Playhouse version we saw, directed by Tom Sutherland, in a slightly underselling way, he says it's from birth to midlife crisis, whereas Stephen Sondheim, I think, has slightly more nicely said it's from birth to rebirth.
Yes, that's a good way.
Which I think is a much better way.
I was going to say sort of Renaissance, or exactly, which I suppose means rebirth. So there we are.
Yes.
Only more pretentious.
Well, I don't see why we should move from the theme we've been establishing.
No, that's kind of.
So that was the question about whether it's a concept. The initial point is, was it ahead of its time? The argument made is that the intention was always it was going to be massively, massively fluid. Well, I suppose there's some logistical things to talk about first as well. It's the first show that combined director and choreographer originally, when it was first on with Agnes DeMille, who'd done all the ballets in Oklahoma and
that's right. That's
their previous work. And Stephen Sondheim recalls that she wasn't very nice to the actors.
No, I've read that,
but also she was a female director, which was an incredibly rare thing if it had happened at all on Broadway that early in the 40s. So there are lots of things like that, but that's logistical and not necessarily something the public would see, and certainly would not have difficulty in understanding. The concept is that the fluidity, they were trying to make the dance and the drama flow into one, so you get that with the music as well. Bits of songs come in and go out of again and then come back again later. I actually thought that one of my favourite songs in it, which is called You Were Never Away, which is a beautiful song by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. I'm prepared to say that. I do like it a great deal. It sort of gets thrown away for there's a 50-second splattering of it in a sequence in a college, when we see Joey in college. And I thought, when that finished, I hope that wasn't it for that song, because that's a lovely song. And then it comes up about 28 times further along the line in Act 1 and in Act 2. So you had this fluidity which was then shown in the music, but you also had the fluidity on the stage. So you had the concertinaing of a life. That first act is actually, if he spends, say, 5 years in the town, and it's a 35-year life we're seeing, then he spends the first 30 years in Act 1 from birth and then learning to walk and then becoming a teenager. Well, you see him as a child, you see him as a teenager at college, and then you see him sort of marrying. That is a concertinaing of life, which we now understand very easily and can be shown very easily, but apparently was quite a difficult thing to show. So they tried to develop what we would now think of as cinematic techniques in theatre. So the way they originally did it, apparently, they divided the set into sort of smaller sets, and then they had an S-shaped curtain, which they would draw around it. So basically your eye was drawn like a wipe, as we would say, if you're watching it on the screen, from one section to the next, and so that section was covered up so it could be prepared for the next scene, and we'd be looking at this, and then it would sweep back immediately, and the actors would go back and forth. probably the easiest analogy that we can understand, therefore, is live television. Not that anyone uses that anymore.
Yeah.
Where you're running from one bit of the stage to another.
Well, of course, that's just come back in a big way, especially for musicals. But,
well, it has indeed on the television, quite.
So people probably can appreciate that now. Yeah, that's very interesting that technique was there, and I suppose it's certainly true. You don't. You trace people, I suppose, in Oklahoma, and I'm just using those as the immediate antecedents, and in Carousel. Well, Oklahoma, you don't really trace people through a very long period of time, do you?
No.
But in Carousel, several years, certainly. But yeah, you're right. We don't have the very beginnings and that sort of length of that time scale.
Was it successful in doing that for your modernised? Because we're so used to cinematic techniques on stage, in the cinema, and indeed on television. It's everywhere now.
Certainly didn't jar with me. I mean, obviously there was strong montage elements to it, and it was absolutely fine. I've actually just thought of another way in which I suppose you could argue it's ahead of its time, or certainly ahead of its time in musical theatre, which is always to say 20 years
behind everything else.
Behind everything else
in drama. Yeah.
But of course, a feature I picked out of Oklahoma and Carousel was that, and again of Rodgers and Hammerstein in general, is there's a guy and a girl, and they get together and they live happily ever after, and it don't happen here.
It didn't happen in Carousel either, did it?
Well, not exactly.
He beats her up and he dies. I know it's every girl's dream, but
well, no, all right, but on the other hand, there isn't then another.
Yes, that's true.
Girl for that guy. Well, obviously not in his case, but there isn't also another guy for that girl. Here we work through two. Let's see, how many relationships? Yeah, we've got the one at college.
Well, is that a relationship?
Well,
you're talking about Jenny, aren't you? His childhood sweetheart, who's painted up as being a bit of a bad one, really. But
she certainly progresses significantly through the.
That's true. Yeah. She's quite manipulative all the way through, though, even from the earliest time when she's writing him letters at college. You're right, but there's the woman who sings "So Far," which is a lovely song.
Yes.
And just taking us on a sidestep, the verse and the chorus are the interesting things there. The verse sounds like Rodgers and Hart.
Yeah.
The chorus sounds like Rodgers and Hammerstein. It's a very odd combination. When you're listening to the first bit, you think, oh, we've gone back to the 1920s, 30s when Rodgers was writing that sprightly stuff he did with Lawrence Hart.
Right.
And then you get into the slightly more lush, slightly more, the obviously Hammersteinian aspects of it, and the slower Rodgers. Which is, we have no traditions, we have, we've got nothing to remember yet, so far.
Yes,
which is actually a really nice concept as a song. And so that's a girlfriend he has at college, but the song ends actually with him, with her, because they've just been on a date, and she's singing this song about how they could progress, and the song ends by her saying, "Oh, the louse, he's fallen asleep." So there's a question about whether he is having an affair. And then later on he falls for the nurse, or rather the nurse falls for him.
That's right, yes.
And it's hinted that they will make something of it.
Yes, that's right, exactly. There are three women in this, in
his love life, as it were.
In his love life, yeah, exactly. And I think, they might have gone as far as they wanted to with sort of premarital sex on stage at the time, or the implication of it.
Flirtations,
in college. Right. I think if you, nowadays, casting a modern eye on it, perhaps the assumption is that it was an affair more of the heart or of...
Well, do you know, I suppose you're right, actually, yeah. I mean, forgive me, he's shown as being very consistent because he's a one-girl guy, except he isn't, is he? You're quite right. No, he's got three by the end of the time he's 35.
He's a three-guy guy, and she's a two-guy lady as well. I mean,
three. She has an affair with, isn't his name Bertrand Woolhaven, the handsome swimmer in Europe?
Of course, yes, of course.
We should say, I'm going to say, that in the Southwark Playhouse production, they had a very handsome actor stripped down to his rather splendidly authentic 1920s swimming trunks, which was
exactly
very pleasing.
Very ahead of its time.
Yes, I liked it. So she's also got 3 on the clock because, spoilers, I'm sorry, people who haven't seen it in the last 70 years, she has an affair, doesn't she, in Act 2?
She does, yeah. Yeah, so that, I think, is a striking difference to, I think, how they typically want you to see their heroes and their heroines. I mean, loyalty, fidelity, both highly prized things, particularly in the conservative sort of mores of the Broadway stage of that time. And here there's a... and I think they're apart from, I think, the childhood sweetheart, I think they are by and large forgiven as well, or expected to be forgiven by the audience.
Yes, well, I don't think Jenny is so much. I mean, I think it's interesting the way that the genders play out very differently here. I mean, forgive me, we are talking about a play written in the 40s, which was retrospectively looking back to 1905 and the years between the two.
Yeah.
And Oscar Hammerstein is a man of that era as well, so I don't want to make too many excuses, but here we are. I think that Jo is seen as a forgivable character, and doing the right thing by his girl. In fact, he's almost ridiculously blind to her thoughts, I think.
Yes.
So he's constant and true, as it were, even though they both end up with the same tally of dalliances, if you like, by the end. Yeah. She has this affair with Woolhaven whilst abroad, which is her father trying to pair her off with someone better than just the country doctor, as he sees it, as he's a businessman. Right. But she's seen to be using that to try and manipulate Joe into proposing to her, which is not in itself a bad thing, but it is seen as manipulative. And then she has she eventually marries Joe. She fights the mother to get Joe.
That's a very interesting fact about it as well, because you have, as you rightly pointed out, you have two parent figures here: Joe's mother and Jenny's
father.
That's right, her father, and quite rightly, you've said that the father is motivated by a financial motive. Now, that's really unusual, actually, for, again, what you would expect from a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. You would expect people to oppose a match, possibly for social reasons or moral reasons or religious reasons, and because they ultimately feel that is the best interest of their child. For financial reasons, cynical financial reasons, I don't know that I've seen that anywhere else. Maybe it is elsewhere.
And they are the most cynical as well, aren't they? Because he's actually looking for someone to take over his business.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, it's not even for her benefit, not to make her rich, but to make him have an heir.
And the mother, and it is for moral reasons, opposes Jenny marrying Joe, but because she sort of sees through her or understands that the sort of simple homely virtues that she is devoted to are the very opposite of where Jenny sees herself going, which is the bright lights and the big city. So that's sort of more consonant with what you might think of as a typical, but Rodgers and Hammerstein sort of motivation, or Hammerstein. But there's no reconciliation between them.
No.
The mother dies having lost that fight. In fact, very shortly before they marry, isn't it? So, which is a very bitter, aspect of the whole thing. Generally speaking, if you were doing a more cliched or more sort of, hokey version of the same story, the mother would survive and she'd become reconciled to, him following his heart. But of course,
that don't happen.
It don't happen.
Funnily enough, well, just finishing Jenny's story, then eventually has an affair with the rich man who basically is pumping money into the hospital where Joe ends up working in the city. Yeah. I don't think you are supposed to forgive her there. And in a way, that's seen as the break for Joe as well, isn't it? It's the final straw for him. That's right, yeah. So I think they are treated very differently on gender basis. I think you are supposed to forgive him, and I think you're supposed to be suspicious of her all the way through. Yes. Because of her manipulation. And then
I think the mother
her.
Points the way to that. Yeah, absolutely. She sees something that he can't see, and that even we can't see at that point.
I have heard, by the way, that that the mother and indeed the grandmother dying, but then lingering on as these kind of
ghost-like
figures, which certainly carry on talking to Joe in some sense, even if you can't hear them. And they do all the way into Act 2 as well, when he's in the city, certainly when he's coming out of the city at the end, is an innovation. But of course, they had the ghost figure in Carousel, their immediate predecessor.
Yeah, although he's your point of view character in that particular case, so they're sort of...
Well, Billy Bigelow.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, he is, you experience the weird sort of heavenly bit from his perspective.
Yeah, even if he's a rotter, as it were. Well, it's his chance for redemption, isn't it? In that?
Yeah, they do fulfil. I've got a feeling, although I can't remember. Does that not hark back to again some very deep theatrical tradition, something to do with the chorus or something like that? I can't remember. I think there might be something about that. But yeah, again, it's not a device, isn't it? Because they don't intervene in the way that Billy Bigelow does, or to give another example, in It's a Wonderful Life, they don't it doesn't serve that kind of purpose.
Or Shakespeare.
Indeed, yes. They're just sort of there to sort of just sadly observe, what's going on.
Use the Force,
Joe. Yeah, I suppose so, yeah. But they don't, but even, there is no use the Force moment, is there?
No, there isn't.
They just sort of watch what happens.
They let him do it and then say, oh, this is good, he's coming home, rather than saying, Joe, come home.
That's right, yeah.
I just want to go back briefly to the gender tropes, because you also spoke about how the mother does fulfil the Hammersteinian ideal, if you like, of the woman's role. There is that particularly soppy song. I mean, once again, it's set in the early days of the marriage, so it must be about 1910, after Joe's been born, where the father and the mother sing this duet about the woman's role is to be at home for her man when he comes home and listen to him and soothe his brow and cook his food.
By no means ahead of its time, that one.
No. Queen Victoria would have looked twice at it.
Well, she was queen.
Yeah, she did have some feminist advantages.
Yes, exactly. It reads, a fellow needs a girl to sit by his side at the end of a weary day, to sit by his side and listen to him talk and agree with the things he'll say.
I agree, Tim.
A fellow needs... By the way, this was parodied by Joyce Grenfell.
Oh, was it?
Which I only realised when I heard the thing in Allegro. It's not quite the same thing, but she did a thing called Openings, and there's a whole series of like Julian Slade-style ones, and sort of like busy, brisk 1920s style reviews, like who's who in the news today, darling Biddy, darling Boo, and all that sort of stuff. And so she does one which is like, sometimes the American shows begin with a moral, and it goes, a person needs a friend to hold his hand as he struggles along the street, and so on, you know. And I reckon it was modelled on that song.
And is it Richard Adamsall doing the music?
It would be probably Bill Blezard doing it for that. I don't know who. I think she might have composed. Well, who knows who composed them? But Bill Blezard was her accompanist at that point, not Richard Adamsall. Anyway, complete digression. But interesting. But in a way, it kind of it showed that the sort of winsomeness of that song, and its almost teeth-itching winsomeness was too much even for Joyce Grenfell.
But isn't that interesting? But it was already a trope, so it's not in any way an innovation. It is not ahead of its time. That element is absolutely retro.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's really just hokey and just awful.
I also want to pick up something you said really early on in this conversation. You spoke about non-naturalistic performances, but is that actually true? Because I tell you how I remember it. I remember the first act, which is set in this country town area, being all, in a theatrical sense, as naturalistic as you can try to do it. And funnily enough, I found the Allegro sequence, particularly the Allegro ballet, at the moment when our heroes, for want of a better word, are commenting on what they see as the weakness of their city environment. They're starting to wake up to what they're being asked to do and what they are becoming as a result of that. Suddenly becomes very non-naturalistic. The Allegro ballet is a very non-naturalistic dance. It was spiky, it was jerky. Yeah. It's done to a very different tempo to the rest of the score. It's a real up-tempo number for Rodgers, which at this stage was a rare thing with Hammerstein. So there's that odd change of theatrical style in it, I think, as well.
Yeah, I don't know. There isn't, I suppose, an equivalent. I mean, perhaps the wedding sequence in the first act, which is, is a little bit... dreamy, I suppose, and indeed I've just noticed here there's a dream sequence after the college gym, it says here as well, so I mean you do get these moments.
There's some odd moments. I know it's not necessarily in the business of being innovative, but there's that scene in the college dance where they're all dancing to Mountain Greenery, which is a Rodgers and Hart song, and you can understand why Richard Rodgers chose a piece of music which was from the contemporary period at which that dance is set. It was set in the 20s, and Mountain Greenery is one of their first hits.
Do we know that he chose it?
According to these notes,
right.
He wrote that is the score, so he put it in, so it's not a subsequent interpolation.
Like that in the production.
It's definitely there. So you get that, but there's that odd sequence, if you remember rightly. They do the Charleston to Mountain Greenery. They're doing their modernistic dance from the 20s. And then they say, we may look like we're being irregular and modernistic and ungainly, but in our heads, this is how we look. I mean, it cuts to a waltz version of Mountain Greenery, and they pretend to be, or they purport to believe that they think they're dancing as gracefully as people 200 years beforehand. Right. And I don't think that's a genuine representation of what young people in the 20s were doing. I don't think young people in the 1920s... The 20s is a construct as a decade anyway. It's the one that, definitely identifies itself as being, we are going to live it up after the war. You have this odd sense of, the Charleston is a kick in the pants to the previous dances.
Yes,
and even down to that, the cliche dance where you do the Charleston and then you wag your finger as you dance it, which we now mock when we pretend to do 1920s dancing.
Yes.
That was a symbolic thing where the young people were mocking their parents who were wagging their finger at the modern kind of dancing in the Charleston.
Yes.
So I think that's a misstep by Hammerstein. I think that's a retro...
Yeah, I suppose in a sense, well, he looked at it from his perspective, his generation perhaps, more than anything else.
Yes, he would have been the generation before. Of course,
yeah, so what he meant was, this is how you'd have looked at it, 50-year-olds in the audience, when you were young.
The paying public.
Try and think of it, try and understand it in this way. It's like when you were waltzing in your 20s, but in just a very different form.
Possibly.
Who knows?
So... do we think, therefore, that it was ahead of its time using those criteria that I've identified, which are the ones that people seem to say are the things.
No, but maybe for Broadway staging.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's as much as you can say. I mean, clearly, but like I said at the beginning, you'd had Brexfile by this time. And,
of course.
It's so, and we're after the war, and I think a lot of water have gone under the bridge, to put it,
with many U-boats in it.
Exactly, but certainly different in its ambitions to what had been immediately foregoing in musical theatre, as indeed had Oklahoma been, as indeed had Showboat been in its time. So I mean, in that sense, it was a bit of a fast forward.
Well, it is interesting. This is their fourth show together, Rodgers and Hammerstein, if you include State Fair, which is their film.
Yeah.
And comes before this. They were seen as massive innovators at the time. Oklahoma was seen as a huge innovation.
Yeah.
And so everything they were doing was seen as innovative, which is hard for us to now see. But so I suppose they just had that reputation for being new and forward thinking. So they were just trading on what they were thought of as being.
Yeah.
I've heard it argued that all the things which failed in Allegro in terms of technique and cinematic usage were then smuggled into South Pacific. Because that was a success, that is seen as one of the ways that the way in for as the cinematic beginnings, if you like, for theatre, even though Allegro is the real one. There's also one tiny, lovely little musical joke, and I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but at the beginning of the overture, the first, and it's a traditional overture with lots of bits of songs woven together to make a sort of a blanket or a fugue, I suppose. The first bit of melody we recognise is from So Far, which is the song that has the lyric, "We have no traditions."
Yes.
And I don't know if that's actually them putting up front, saying, look, we're still innovating.
Oh, I see.
The very first thing you'll hear in this new innovative show is the fact that we don't live by the traditions of Broadway.
Indeed. Totally contradicted later on by Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh, I see, yes, quite, yes. The tradition.
Exactly.
So that's the first piece of received wisdom. Let's go on to the second one, which is that the problem with Allegro, the reason it failed, is Act 2. So I'm going to ask you a question. Well, first of all, do you concur with that?
Maybe a bit.
I'm afraid I probably do, but...
I think, in terms of the milieu, Act 1 is a nice place to be. It's cosy, it's charming, it's small town, and it reminds you, as has been often pointed out, of Our Town by Thornton Wilder, which was a sort of a bit of an Undermilk Wood of the, although obviously we're prior to Undermilk Wood here, of the American scene. In other words, not too much of enormous consequence happening, but very familiar, very universal, and very comforting, and basically nothing to sort of make you, feel horrible and anxious.
No one sitting down to rocking
and the whole point of the second act is to take you to a place of anxiety, moral ambiguity, uncertainty, difficult decisions, headaches, work, all of those things. And so it really rather harshly ejects you from one world into another. And I wonder if, not so much that the second act is not successful, because I actually think it does come round to quite a good conclusion, but more that it just suddenly just throws you into the middle of the New York street, having sort of worked your way in a hayrick through, I forget what the state is, but because it's so universal.
Kentucky, I think.
Kentucky, yeah. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons it sort of does a number on the audience a little bit, as it were, quite. Because it's almost a sort of a bait and switch.
Well, it de-wombs you as well, doesn't it?
I don't know.
Well, by which
that from Macbeth?
By which I mean, of course, that the comfiness is like being still yet to be born, and the being spat out, as it were, onto the streets of New York is the harsh reality of life.
It speaks of innocence and experience, yes, is how I would say, and
yes.
And so I think. So I think it sort of is almost like two different shows. If they could, maybe they should have done it that way. Like, come back for the second half if you want to know what life is really like. Yeah, so I think, and I think, like you said at the very, very beginning, the first half is what you think of as a Rodgers and Hammerstein show. The second half is what you think of more as a Rodgers and Hart show.
Certainly.
Brittle, cynical. If you look at that main number, the title number, Allegro, is a sort of little cynical riff on like how modern life is
satirical,
done.
Absolutely, yeah. And sneering.
Yeah.
Actually, it sneers at the sneerers.
Absolutely.
As it sees it.
And even things like The Gentleman's a Dope, which is a love song, but very much much more mordant, much more sort of, again, much more belonging to the world of Brecht and Weil and indeed of Rodgers and Hart. So I think, like on Amazon, if you like this, you might like that. The first and second act of Allegro wouldn't necessarily be in the same recommendation list.
That's such an advert, isn't it? If you liked Act 1 of Allegro,
you might like
something else.
Yeah, you might like that. Yeah, exactly. You might like Oklahoma or Our Town by Thornton Wilder. So I reckon that's what the problem is.
Well, I'm going to try a little experiment on you, an empirical test, really, which is, can you tell me what the second act is about?
Plot-wise, or
yes, plot-wise. And and the reason I ask is because where there has been analysis, seems to be where the problem has occurred, about what it's supposed to be about and what it seems to be about.
Okay.
I just want to know.
Well, I mean, on the surface, what it's about is that he goes and becomes a doctor in the big city, and he's placed under pressure because the major patron of the hospital, his wife, is one of the doctor's patients, Joe's patients, and he has to learn to go from the business of trying to work out what's wrong with somebody to bowing to the pressure to prescribe the pills that they're basically asking for.
Which they don't probably need. Yeah.
And not asking questions about it.
They're all neurotic New Yorkers, aren't they, his patients?
Yeah, that's right.
They're the upper set.
A bit rather spoiled and perhaps not so much deserving of the love and care and attention that he has in his heart. And and there are other corruptions, aren't there? Like, for example, there's a desire to get rid of a member of staff who's caused trouble or been a member of the union, and he finds it very difficult to square that with his conscience. There's a nurse who is working in his surgery who also has similar moral problems, and they find common cause in that, despite the fact that the machinations of the plot force them against each other or force her against him. So that's and then of course ultimately he's pursuing a path of promotion, and he's to be raised to a partner or a board member, I forget, or a fellow, I can't remember what the exact term is. And of course it's that climactic point that he disavows the whole thing and then returns to the, as you so delicately put it, the womb of the first half.
It's the waiting womb.
By deciding that his destiny was not ever in this great big cynical money-making hospital, but actually back in the small surgery and the tiny community of his childhood.
So the lesson you draw from that is it that the situation that he finds himself, the city corrupts?
It's that he moves from a position of thinking that you need all of your nous and courage to negotiate the city, when actually what it takes is nous and courage to leave that. And I think that's the sort of point.
Now that's interesting. The general analysis, such as it is, and this comes from Hammerstein himself and Sondheim as well, pushes this line as the Hammersteinian ideal, is that Hammerstein was in a way trying to talk about what he suffered from the moment he became famous, which is that he was a writer who got success and started being feted by the upper set and society. And therefore, with that came invitations to chair committees and sit on boards and go to fundraisers, which took him away from doing what he was actually there to do, which was be a writer. Yeah. And he resented that, although he did it. I mean, if you actually look at the list of bodies on which Oscar Hammerstein was sitting at the time he died, you'll find there was quite a number, and some of them I don't think have survived into the 21st century, so they were very much of their period. But that's apparently what Oscar Hammerstein himself said he was trying to get across, and he acknowledges, however, that isn't what the audience got, because what the audience seemed to have taken away from it is that city life is bad and country life is good.
There's no place like home, in other words.
Exactly, and city life is ultimately corrupting, and therefore, and that city dwellers are facile, empty vessels, neurotic. Because the play, and he acknowledges that he did not write the second act well enough, or he must not have written the second. It's the wording here, because people weren't seeing what he was really trying to get across.
Which is, and of course, you must be true to yourself.
But it does feel,
whether it's in the city or not.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, But it looked like he was being corrupted by the evil ways of the city. And the problem is that when you put on a show like a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, when you've got a reputation, you are going to be taking, probably on the road or in New York on Broadway, you're going to be doing it to city dwellers.
Yes.
And so you were basically telling your audience that their way of life was empty, venal, corrupting, wrong.
Yes, that's very interesting. Although, I mean, hadn't the two previous ones sort of done that, but without sort of rubbing it in, I suppose.
There was no city slickers come in to make idiots of themselves in it, though.
The appeal of the show was to either people who themselves had come from the countryside and therefore it was a nostalgic buzz for them, or for people who'd never ever been there and could still somehow feel nostalgic about it anyway because they'd read Mark Twain.
Which is also done in Britain. I mean, the countryside is fetishised by city dwellers stupidly all the time.
Absolutely. And in a sense, it sort of does deliver on that, but as you say, it sort of does it by negative comparison, perhaps more than positive affirmation.
But yet it is there in little bits. Because I think the most telling thing in the second act, completely actually, is once again, we're talking about this lovely nurse who is a good and decent person. And it's the end of a working day. She's been working with Dr. Joe, who she fancies and loves. And he doesn't see, because he just doesn't see it at all, because hence the gentleman is a dope.
Yes.
That's the song there. But he's just about to go on to some big fundraising do or big social event with his wife, who's very much into the big fundraising events and social life that come with it. So she likes her networking. He's a bit more reluctant. There's a pile of, I think it's x-rays have come in, or graphs or something or other of patients. And the nurse, he says, there's no problem with any of these, you can just write to them or whatever. And the nurse says, I think you should look again at this one on the top, doctor. There's a problem with it, I think, as a humble nurse. And he looks again at it. And the way I was reading that was that the hospital deals with the rich, but it also deals with the poor. Yeah. We just never see the speech marks, the real city dwellers, in the second act at all. All we get is this sort of high-class set of neurotic, drug-taking people sitting on charity boards and living the blob life, in fact, which is actually referenced. There's a song, is it called Yatatat or something like that, where they just make noises about, everything is baloney, and it's the small, low-level small talk. In fact, I think one of the characters in it briefly says, I'm so busy, I get up at 11:30 every morning, and I'm so busy with this, that, and then it's time for cocktails at 5, I'm so busy, can't get anything done. So, you're invited to sneer at these people and not like them because they're empty. But anyway, the doctor then he sends his wife on to the event and says, I'll follow on, and he goes back and looks and realises there is something wrong, and he does something about it, but he has to be pulled back into the real doctoring for real people. But it's the absence of the real people in that piece. We never see them. They just aren't there. The nurse is really the only representative, and she's on the hospital staff, so she doesn't count that. And as a result, it's very difficult to see that. I think Hammerstein was trying to say, no, it's only this kind of person in the city who's a bad one.
Yes, no, I think that's true, I mean, effectively, if the message is, as you say, like, status and money aren't everything, which is... Again,
well, it's a song, isn't it? The comic opener of Act 2 is actually a very drudgy, slow-moving comic song called Money Isn't Everything, the punchline being, as long as you're not poor.
Yes, exactly.
And I'll tell you, do you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of By the Sea in the second act of Sweeney Todd.
Oh, right.
It's one of those, we've got to have a comic number right at the beginning of Act 2.
Yes.
This'll do. And it also doesn't really relate to anything else that's going on, particularly. I mean, you could argue that, it's poor people in this case, back at home still. And we're post-stock market crash, aren't we, in that scene, actually? Because the rich father of Jenny has now had to come and live with the doctor who he was earlier sneering on.
Does it not happen in the interval, in fact?
Yeah.
The Wall Street crash, yes, indeed.
So that's the problem with Act 2 as far as I see it.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right. I think people can buy sort of, who's virtuous and who's not. I think perhaps another aspect of it is that given their previous form, and indeed the previous form of the whole of Broadway up to that point, arguably as well, or very nearly, other than perhaps Brecht-File, if you were going out to a big musical, perhaps one of the things, and you were a busy, stressed city dweller, it really does rather sort of return you to your working life, doesn't it, in the second half, and doesn't really offer you much comfort, because
it's
just
not
basically
escapist,
says,
is it?
if you're a middle manager and you bought a theatre ticket tonight, let's just remind you how
miserable
rubbish
your life
is.
Well, you do see the grind of the day-to-day diurnal job round, don't you?
Yeah.
For Dr. Joe, and indeed his friend, I can't remember if he's called Charlie or something. He's got a Lothario friend from university who's also a doctor.
Yeah.
and just comes in every now and then when a song is needed.
And when it has the big company numbers, then they're ironised. So the Allegro as a big company number is just an ironised number. You know, there isn't much out and out joy anywhere in the whole thing, actually. Even except I would say in that signature song, One Foot Out, One Foot Other Foot.
Yes.
Which is actually a total display of utter, and the wedding perhaps as well. Although the wedding is
and the birth
is bittersweet.
Yeah, the wedding is not unalloyed.
The birth and his very early stage of childhood. That's this great outpouring of innocent joy.
Well, innocence is the word, I think, isn't it? Actually, I mean, it's not a very profound thing to observe, but Joe loses his innocence fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, the moment Jenny starts being manipulative with him in a way.
Yeah. Now, do we read sort of anything Garden of Eden-esque into all of this? Because
you mean the fall of man?
Well, she's venal, she's ambitious. It turns out we don't necessarily know it straight right at the beginning. So I think she
doesn't come on naked with an apple, though, does she?
She does. She is a little somewhat three-dimensional as a character, in as much as that she doesn't start from that place, but it emerges as a characteristic in her. He doesn't move on very much, really. He actually sort of preserves his integrity a lot of the way through. And that is to say, it's not difficult to believe that he's very similar to the young man that he was. He remains idealistic and cannot be bent entirely out of shape, it turns out, by the end. But she is, and she moves in that way. It's maybe a little bit simplistic to sort of go, well, the gender politics of that are awful because she's awful and he's good. But on the other hand, there's something about her character that does seem that she's more of a cipher, more of a plot device. Like her internal logic and her reality are very seldom exposed to us. And on the one occasion that it is, the chorus guide her to how she can manipulate Joe.
They do, yeah.
Over the business of having a baby and so on. Certainly, and in a way that was especially exemplified in this production, because they actually showed the chorus pointing at
babies on the wall,
babies on illustrations of babies and stuff. So as if it was a very calculated series of things that she was doing, and I think that maybe pushed her out of the world of being a sort of a plausible, identifiable character. And if you're going to have emotional complexity and moral complexity in a thing, often that comes from the fact that you can see two people's points of view, even though they're contradictory, and you see that they're both in some ways right or doing the right thing. And it's a shame that we never really get that for her. We sort of think that she's doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons a lot of the time, and it's not entirely clear what, other than shallowness and vanity, is provoking her. And usually a great strength of musical theatre is that you get to empathise with a lot of people.
Well, you can reveal an inner thought.
Well, precisely.
For a song.
Yeah. So you know whether it's her desire for security, or it's her desire for a child, or it's her desire for whatever it is. The
child was never mentioned up to the point where she suddenly declared she wanted
which is why it's clearly
foreshadowed in any way.
Seen as a manipulation.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's unsatisfying at that level, I think, and and that was a weakness, I think, of the book writing, definitely. The female characters really act as in a motherly fashion, which is the mother and the grandmother, effectively. One as conscience as well,
yes,
in the second half, and then one as sort of the thing. I don't know if that's a weakness of those female characters, or if it's a weakness of the way he's written, because he's a cipher.
Well, he is a cipher, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, the observation has been made on a couple of occasions that Stephen Sondheim, sitting watching this being rehearsed and performed, sees a character who is in his 30s
acted upon rather than acting,
and thought, company.
Yes,
I see Bobby.
I see Bobby. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's true. Actually, yeah, he is a sort of he's a bit of a tabula rasa, isn't he? So, which of course is a characteristic of that type of everyman character. Anything that connects universally to a lot of people, he can't have that many characteristics.
No,
you lose some of your audience every time you add one. So,
well, he's funny enough, he's a bit like Tintin. When you actually look and analyse Tintin, Tintin has almost no characteristics.
There's no motive force. Yes,
so you fill that empty vessel with what you want Tintin to be, which is why people have affection, because essentially they turned him into what they wanted.
Not just him, but pretty much every hero of children's literature ever. Yeah. Anyway, we digress.
But Tintin's a good example, because around Tintin you have these particularly ripe and fruity characters. Captain Haddock is a swearing sailor. You've got the mad deaf professor. You've got the lustful opera singer. These are very rich, full-blooded, juicy, steaky characters around which this sort of thin water biscuit. I love Tintin, but that's what you're getting. You're getting a sorbet covered in the richest, gouty, big sauce.
Oh, what a lovely metaphor. And in next week's Tintin podcast, we shall be exploring that further.
We'll be cooking Snowy in his own juices.
Goodness.
So, taking us back then to the second piece of received wisdom, which is the second act is the failure in Allegro. We generally think that's the case.
No, I think it's that second act with that first act.
It's the combination.
It's not the fact that the second act is a terrible thing.
Well, on that note, we've put to bed two discussions so far on Allegro, the two pieces of received wisdom. We'll talk a bit more, I think, about some other things that we've been thinking about it next week. But for the moment, Tim, it's been a great pleasure having you here. Thank you very much indeed for being do you want to be the Rodgers to my Hammerstein, or the Hammerstein to my Rodgers? Or are you just going to settle for being the Ampersand?
I'll just be Mr. Rodgers, I think, and... please be my neighbour.
Thank you very much indeed. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood, and was edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2017. And this episode is dedicated to our dear friend John Sweeney, just so he knows we're thinking of him at this difficult time. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk, or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.
The feet... Here's a little bit more level for you. Now you can do whatever you want to do. Here you are in a wonderful world, especially made for you. Now you can march around the yard, shout to all the neighbourhood, tell the folks you're feeling good. Folks ought to know when boys feel good. Now you can imitate a dog, chase a bird around a tree. It's just a list of fetishes, isn't it?
Yes.
You can chase a bumblebee. Once is enough to chase a bee. Now you can play among the flowers. Grab yourself a hunk of dirt. Smudge it on your mother's hunk of dirt. I remember those. Used to be to order those from the Sainsbury's.
I thought for a second it was you misread the punctuation. Grab yourself a hunk.
Yes.
Extremely forward of you there, Oscar.
My name is Hunko Dirt. My name is Hunko Dirt. Now you can do whatever you want to do. Is this good enough for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Gorgeous.
I'm getting the outtakes in first, I see.
Yeah, I see, yeah.